For most people, silence is an absence, a brief pause between the noises of life. But for Arthur, it was the entire language. His world wasn't empty, it was simply written in a different script, one composed of light, shadow, and the subtle vibrations that travel through the soles of his shoes. He didn't hear the morning alarm. He felt the programmed tremor of the small disc under his pillow. He didn't hear the coffee maker gurgle to life. He saw the faint steam coiling towards the kitchen ceiling, a silent ghost announcing the day had truly begun. His life was a tapestry woven from details others discarded. He knew the mailman not by the rumble of his truck, but by the precise way his shadow fell across the lawn at 8:47 a.m. He could tell Mrs. Gable from 2 blocks away by the unique, agitated bob of her floral sun hat. In a world screaming for attention, Arthur found profound meaning in the whispers. He saw the stories etched into the cracks of the pavement, the silent arguments played out in the twitch of a curtain, the fleeting histories of every scuff mark on a stranger's shoe. His deafness was not a disability, it was a filter, one that removed the cacophony and left only the truth. Every day followed a sacred rhythm. A walk to the small park at the end of his block, a black coffee from the corner cafe where the barista knew to simply show him the total on the screen, and then a seat on his usual bench. From this vantage point, the neighborhood unfolded like a silent film. The manicured lawns, the freshly painted fences, the cheerful waves between neighbors, it was a performance of suburban perfection. Arthur, the sole audience member in a theater of silence, watched it all, appreciating the choreography while sensing the tension in the actors' shoulders. It was on this bench that he first truly noticed Lily. A small girl, maybe 7 years old, with hair the color of dandelion fluff and eyes that held a galaxy of questions. Unlike the other children whose movements were chaotic and loud, hers were deliberate, almost quiet. She didn't run, she glided. She didn't shout, she communicated with the world through the intense focus of her gaze, tracing patterns on the ground with a stick or watching a single ant embark on an epic journey across a leaf. In her, Arthur saw a fellow speaker of his silent language. But it was what he saw around her that first planted a seed of unease. The way other parents would gently steer their children away when she approached. The way her own mother's smile seemed painted on, a brittle facade that never quite reached her eyes. The fleeting glances, sharp and cold as ice, that were exchanged when people thought no one was watching. On this perfectly ordinary street, in this flawlessly serene neighborhood, something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And Arthur, the man who saw everything, was beginning to see the cracks in the beautiful lie. The late afternoon sun bled across the rooftops, turning the quiet street into a canvas of gold and long, deep shadows. For Arthur, this was the most honest time of day, when light and darkness told the truth about shapes and distances. His gaze, a silent sentinel, drifted from the swaying oak tree to the familiar pattern of windows across the way. It was a ritual, this silent accounting of his world. Then his eyes settled on Lily's window. Taped to the inside of the glass was a new piece of art, a splash of crayon color against the fading light. It was a common sight, her latest creation displayed for the world, but this one held his attention longer than usual. A flicker of movement, perhaps just a trick of the light, made him lean closer, his focus narrowing until the rest of the world dissolved into a soft blur. At first glance, it was everything a child's drawing should be. A bright yellow sun with perfectly straight rays occupied one corner. A boxy blue house with a triangle roof sat proudly in the center, smoke curling from its chimney in a single looping line. Stick figures stood on a lawn of vibrant green, their circular hands joined in a chain of familial unity. There was a mother, a father, and a small girl with wild orange hair, Lily. Arthur almost smiled at the innocent simplicity, the pure, unedited joy of a world rendered in wax and paper. It was a portrait of the perfect family on the perfect day. Yet, his gaze kept being pulled back to one specific area, a magnet for his detail-oriented mind, a slight dissonance in the otherwise cheerful composition. He squinted, tracing the lines with his eyes. The mother and Lily were smiling, their mouths drawn as wide, happy arcs. The father, however, was different. His mouth was a single, flat, horizontal line. An expression of neutrality or perhaps something else entirely. And then he saw it, the source of the discord. Directly behind the father figure, in the sea of cheerful green grass, was a patch that was different. The color was a muddy, angry brown, scribbled over the green with such force that the paper was visibly buckled, even from a distance. And cutting through this patch was a single, jagged line. It wasn't drawn, it was gouged into the page. A deep, violent scar left by a crayon pressed far beyond its breaking point. It was the visual equivalent of a slammed door in a quiet library. Arthur's mind, a finely tuned instrument for pattern recognition, struggled to categorize the input. A broken crayon was not unusual. A child's frustration was not unusual. But the placement, the focused intensity of that single violent mark in an otherwise serene picture felt deliberate. It was an anomaly. His entire life was built on observing these subtle shifts. The slight tremor in a person's hand that betrayed a lie, the way a shadow falls differently, indicating something has moved. This broken line was a tremor in the landscape of Lily's world. He looked from the drawing to the house itself. The curtains were drawn. The porch was empty. The perfect, quiet facade he saw every day suddenly seemed less like a sign of peace and more like a carefully constructed wall. He pushed himself away from the window, trying to dismiss the feeling, to file it away as an overactive imagination. But the image was seared into his memory: the happy family, the father with no smile, and the violent, brown scar on the earth behind him. He looked back one last time. The drawing was still there, a silent testament hanging in the window. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a signal, a tiny flag raised in a silent kingdom. For the first time, the profound quiet that enveloped Arthur's life didn't feel like a comfort. It felt like a vacuum, a space where a scream should be. That drawing was the first crack in the neighborhood's perfect silence, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him that he was the only one who had heard it. The image of the drawing, with its jagged lines and hidden figure, was burned into Arthur's mind. It was a catalyst, transforming his passive observation into a focused, almost obsessive vigilance. His window was no longer just a frame for the street. It became a lens, a private theater for a silent drama. He began to watch with intention, learning the rhythm of the house across the way, the time the car left, the brief moments Lily was in the yard, the way the curtains were always drawn too tight. He was searching for another signal, convinced the first was not an accident but a message tossed into an ocean of silence. During one vigil he noticed the gesture. At first it was fleeting, easily dismissed as a child's nervous tic. When Lily was in her yard, believing she was unobserved, her right hand would flutter near her shoulder. A quick, repetitive motion like brushing away an invisible insect. But there was a precision to it, a strange deliberateness that felt rehearsed. It happened just after the back door closed and just before she turned to her toys. Arthur, a man who understood the world through movement, recognized this was not a simple action. It was a piece of a larger, unspoken conversation he was just beginning to overhear. Then came the toys. Her collection was small, a worn teddy bear and some colorful blocks. To anyone else, her play would seem unremarkable, even sad in its solitude. But Arthur saw the patterns. The teddy bear was never embraced. Instead, it was meticulously placed in the sandbox, its face pressed firmly against the wooden siding. The blocks were never stacked high into castles. They were always laid flat, end to end, forming a rigid, unbroken line in the dirt, a wall, a boundary. These weren't joyful creations of a child's imagination. They were symbols in a silent, meaningful ritual. Days turned into a week and the ritual became undeniable. The sequence was always the same. The back door would close, Lily would perform the quick brushing motion at her shoulder, and then build her silent barricade and exile her companion. The connection clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The gesture wasn't about brushing something away, it was about pushing something off. The line of blocks wasn't a wall, it was a desperate attempt to keep something out. The bear, facing the corner, was a witness forced to look away. This was not play. It was a reenactment. He finally understood. This was a language, a system of signs born from a place where words were too dangerous to use. It was a language of shadows, spoken in fleeting movements and the placement of objects. The broken crayon hadn't been a singular event. It was the first syllable of a sentence he could now read. Lily was screaming for help, but her scream made no sound. It was coded into her every action, a broadcast on a frequency only he, in his world of silence, was equipped to receive. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was the sole audience to a silent plea. The shift from passive observer to active chronicler was a subtle but profound one. Arthur's small apartment began to resemble a detective's office, though the evidence was far stranger than any case file. He bought a simple black-bound notebook, its empty pages a stark contrast to the complex, silent story he was about to transcribe. Each entry began with a date, a time, and the view from his window. He meticulously sketched the toy soldier formations from memory, the plastic figures standing as silent witnesses to a language he was just beginning to learn. This was no longer a curious pastime, It was a heavy, solemn duty. The weight of each observation settled upon him, a responsibility he had not asked for but could not ignore. He was documenting a conversation no one else could hear. The first truly systematic clue appeared on a Tuesday. A single, faded yellow ribbon, tied to the lowest branch of the oak tree that bordered her yard. It hadn't been there the day before. From his vantage point, it was a small, almost insignificant detail, a flicker of color against the rough bark. But its placement was deliberate, precise, visible only from a specific angle, his angle. He sketched it in his notebook, noting the way it fluttered in the breeze. The next day it was gone. But a week later, on another Tuesday, it reappeared. This was not a child's forgotten plaything. It was a signal, a flag raised on a silent battlefield. He began to log its appearances and disappearances, a calendar of color that seemed to correspond with the rhythm of the house next door. Then came the marks on the fence. On the weathered gray wood of the back fence, almost hidden by a thicket of overgrown bushes, he noticed a series of fresh scratches. They were stark white against the aged wood, etched with what looked like a sharp stone. There were 3 vertical lines, followed by a 4th horizontal line scored through them. It was a primitive counting method, a tally. He took a photograph with his old film camera, the click of the shutter feeling like an intrusion. A few days later, a new set of 3 vertical lines appeared next to the first. This was different from the ephemeral ribbon. This was permanent. A record being kept, a score being settled. Each new mark was another whispered word, carved into the boundary between her world and his. The most disturbing element, however, was the one that came directly from her hand. A gust of wind blew a piece of paper from her yard onto his small patio. It was a child's doodle, drawn in that same urgent crayon style. In the corner, almost an afterthought, was a symbol, a tight spiral with a single dark dot in its center. His blood ran cold. He recognized it instantly. It was a smaller, more frantic version of the shape hidden in the clouds of the very first drawing he had found. It was her signature. Not a name, but a feeling, a symbol of being trapped, of a shrinking world with a dark presence at its core. He now had a recurring motif, a psychological thumbprint that connected the disparate pieces of this silent puzzle. He spread his evidence across his small kitchen table. The photographs of the fence, the sketches of the ribbon, the drawings with the insidious spiral. The pieces were no longer isolated incidents. A pattern was emerging, a terrifying and undeniable logic. The yellow ribbon appeared on days when the tall, shadowy figure wasn't seen. A new scratch was added to the fence the morning after a late-night argument was faintly heard through the walls. The spiral was drawn larger, darker after weekends. This wasn't a collection of clues, it was an unseen tapestry, woven with threads of fear and desperation. The frightening narrative was taking shape, and as he connected the dots, Arthur realized the picture it was forming was far more monstrous than he could have ever prepared himself for. The weight of his discovery was a physical thing, a pressure building behind his eyes. The intricate tapestry of Lily's silent language was no longer a mystery to solve, but a verdict he was forced to read. Each symbol, each carefully placed doll, was a word in a sentence that screamed of a danger he could no longer ignore. The period of quiet observation was over. It had given way to a terrifying clarity. He knew, with an unshakable certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not be the sole keeper of this knowledge. The silence had to be broken not by Lily but by him. He was the only one who had learned her language, and now he had a duty to be her translator, to give voice to her soundless plea before it was too late. His first attempt was with Mr. Henderson, the retired mailman who prided himself on knowing the pulse of the neighborhood. Arthur approached him cautiously, his notebook clutched in his hand like a shield. He didn't rely on his voice, which he knew could be a clumsy instrument. Instead, he opened the book to the pages filled with his meticulous sketches. The recurring bird symbol, the sequence of knots in the ribbon, the precise angles of the dolls left on the porch. He pointed, tracing the patterns with his finger, trying to convey the timeline, the consistency, the sheer intentionality of it all. He looked into Henderson's eyes, trying to impart the urgency that was clawing at his own throat, hoping the man would see the logic, the undeniable pattern woven from these disparate, innocent-looking threads. Henderson squinted at the pages, a flicker of interest quickly dissolving into a placid, almost pitying smile. He clapped Arthur on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring but felt profoundly dismissive. "Arthur, my friend," he said, his voice slow and patronizing, "you've always had a keen eye for detail. A real gift. But sometimes when you're trying so hard to see things, you see patterns that aren't really there. The mind plays tricks. Especially, he added, with a gentle tap to his own ear, when it's trying to compensate. The unspoken words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Your deafness is making you imagine things. His perception, his most trusted tool, was being invalidated by the one sense he lacked. A cold wave of frustration washed over Arthur, so intense it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just disbelief, it was a complete erasure of his reality. They weren't just doubting his conclusion, they were doubting his very ability to perceive the world correctly. He saw it then, the invisible wall rising between him and everyone else. It was built of their polite smiles, their condescending pats on the back, their well-meaning but utterly deafening skepticism. They saw a quiet, deaf old man with an overactive imagination, not a witness to a desperate, silent confession. He was completely, utterly alone, trapped on one side of the wall with Lily's secret, a burden that now felt heavier than ever before. He walked away from Henderson not with defeat, but with a cold, hardening resolve. The world had refused to listen. They had used his silence against him, turning his unique perception into a flaw, a reason for doubt. Very well. If they would not see, he would have to act. If they would not listen, he would have to become more than a translator. The wall they had built around him didn't just isolate him, it also freed him. He was no longer bound by their rules of evidence, their need for a conventional witness. He was the sole guardian of Lily's truth, and he now understood with chilling certainty that he would be her sole protector as well. The hunt was no longer for an ally, but for a solution. With the wall of disbelief now firmly erected around him, Arthur's frustration calcified into a diamond-hard resolve. He was alone in this, and that clarity was a strange, cold comfort. The tapestry of clues, the ribbons, the scratches, the symbols, was no longer just a collection of abstract warnings. He realized he had been reading a map without understanding its destination. The pattern wasn't just in the objects, it was in the moments they appeared. He shifted his entire focus from the what to the who. Every person in Lily's small world was now a variable in a terrifying equation. He watched from his window, a silent sentinel, his gaze sweeping over the mailman, the crossing guard, her friend's parents. He was no longer looking for a monster in the shadows. He was looking for the shadow that walked in the light. It didn't take long. The source was not the loud, boisterous neighbor or the perpetually frowning teacher. It was someone far more insidious, someone who had perfected the camouflage of kindness. Mr. Henderson, the man from 2 houses down. He was a pillar of the community, always ready with a wave, a disarmingly warm smile, and a pocket full of hard candies for the neighborhood kids. To everyone else he was a harmless, grandfatherly figure. But to Arthur, who watched the world without the distraction of sound, Henderson's performance was flawed. Arthur's eyes, trained by a lifetime of reading the subtle shifts in a face, could see the tiny cracks in the facade, the dissonance between the performed warmth and the cold, predatory stillness that lay beneath. Arthur's observation became a singular, obsessive focus. He would watch Henderson interact with Lily in the front yard, a scene that looked utterly benign to any passerby. But Arthur saw what they couldn't. He saw the micro-expression, a flicker of possessive satisfaction in Henderson's eyes as he placed a hand on Lily's head, a gesture that lasted a half-second too long. He saw the way Henderson's smile never quite reached his eyes, leaving them flat and watchful. He noticed the unsettling way the man's posture would subtly shift, angling his body to block Lily from her parents' view for a fleeting moment. These were the signals that existed beneath the threshold of hearing, a silent language of control and menace that only Arthur could read. The connection was undeniable. When Henderson was near, Lily's silent alarms would scream. The blue ribbon, her signal for fear, would be twisted and knotted in her hair the next morning. Fresh, frantic scratches would appear on the fence post behind her house. Arthur watched one afternoon as Henderson gave her a small, wrapped candy. Lily's parents smiled and waved from the porch, but Arthur saw her hand tremble. He saw the almost imperceptible flinch, a recoiling of her shoulder that she tried to disguise as a casual shrug. She took the candy, but her entire body became a rigid monument to a fear so profound it was suffocating her. The proximity of the shadow wasn't just a coincidence. It was the direct cause of her silent distress. He now understood the true nature of the threat. This wasn't a simple case of bullying or a childhood fear of the dark. This was a calculated, patient predation. Henderson's kindness was a weapon, his public persona a shield. Every seemingly innocent gesture was a move in a horrifying game, played in a dimension of nuance and subtlety that the hearing world was completely blind to. The shadow in the frame of Lily's life now had a name and a face, a smiling, friendly face that knew with chilling certainty that its secrets were safe. But it hadn't accounted for the boy next door, the one who saw everything. It happened in the profound stillness of 3 in the morning, a time when the world outside was as silent as his own. Arthur sat at his small desk, the floor around him a chaotic mosaic of Lily's art. He had been staring at the same collection of images for weeks, seeing only the iconography of fear, the jagged teeth, the swirling vortex, the tall, slender figure with no face. But in that moment something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a change in perception, as if a filter had been lifted from his eyes. He realized he had been interpreting the drawings as emotional expressions, as metaphors for a monster. He was wrong. They weren't metaphors. They were instructions. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like an electric shock, he began to gather the pages. He wasn't just looking at individual nightmares anymore, he was looking for a sequence, a connection. He laid them out on the living room floor, a sprawling, desperate puzzle. The recurring spiral wasn't a descent into madness, it was a road. The series of sharp, angry triangles wasn't a monster's teeth, it was a fence line. That dark, looming circle she always drew in the top corner wasn't an empty sun. It was a structure, something man-made and round. He was looking at a landscape, drawn from the fragmented and terrified memory of a child. It was a cartography of fear. His hands trembled as he opened his laptop, the bright screen illuminating the dark room. He pulled up a satellite map of their county, the familiar grid of streets and parks giving way to the undeveloped outskirts. He began to drag the map, his eyes darting between the screen and the crayon drawings on the floor. He traced the path of the spiral drawing, matching it to a winding, unpaved service road leading away from the old industrial park. He found the fence line, a jagged scar of rusted chain link separating the road from an overgrown field. And then he saw it. A single, circular structure standing alone, casting a long shadow in the satellite photo. The old, abandoned water tower. It all matched. The breath caught in his throat. This was not a story about a nebulous, psychological threat. The shadow in the frame, the person he had been watching with such intense focus, was not just an abuser inflicting emotional wounds. They were a planner. This was logistical. The drawings weren't a recollection of past trauma. They were a rehearsal for a future event. Lily had been shown this place, forced to memorize its features until they were burned into her subconscious. The fear was real because the destination was real. It was a tangible place where something terrible was meant to happen. The weight of this revelation was crushing. The stakes had just escalated from protecting a child's mind to preventing a concrete, physical act. The game had changed. It was no longer about deciphering a feeling, but about intercepting a plan. He had a location, a where, but the what and the when remained horrifyingly blank. All he knew was that a desolate spot on the edge of town, marked only by crayon and terror, was the designated endpoint of Lily's nightmare. And the countdown to that event had already begun, ticking away in a silence only he could truly understand. The map was no longer just a map, it was a stage. With the where, now terrifyingly clear, Arthur felt a new kind of urgency grip him. The question of when echoed in the silent room, a frantic pulse against the quiet hum of his equipment. He turned back to the scattered collection of Lily's drawings, his eyes scanning them not for locations, but for rhythms, for patterns, for the subtle language of time. He'd been looking at them as static images, but now he saw them as a sequence, a silent film telling a story in a language he was only just beginning to understand. The position of the sun in one sketch, hanging low and red over the horizon, seemed to correspond with the number of wilting leaves on a tree in another. It was a calendar of decay, a clockwork of dread ticking away in crayon and graphite. He scrambled, pinning drawings to the wall in a new order, his mind racing to connect the disparate symbols. A recurring image of a bird with a missing wing, appearing 7 times. A crudely drawn moon shown in 3 distinct phases, ending in a perfect, ominous circle. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening thud. In several drawings of her own house, Lily had colored the panes of her bedroom window in a specific pattern of light and dark. It wasn't random. It was a binary countdown, and the sequence was ending. The final drawing showed a window that was completely dark. The timeline wasn't measured in weeks or days. It was measured in hours. The event at the desolate quarry wasn't a distant threat looming in the future. It was tonight. A wave of cold panic washed over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency number, but he stopped. What would he say? He pictured the dispatcher's skeptical voice on the other end of the line. "Sir, You believe a crime is going to be committed at the old quarry, based on a 7-year-old's artwork? They would ask for evidence, for names, for anything concrete. All he had were interpretations. He had a chillingly accurate profile of a predator, built from micro-expressions and unsettling gestures invisible to anyone else. He had a map drawn from the nightmares of a child. It was a powerful narrative, but in the eyes of the law, it was nothing. If you've ever felt like you saw a truth that no one else would believe, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think Arthur's next move should be. The weight of his isolation was immense. He was the sole keeper of this terrible secret, the only one who could read the silent warnings. To call the authorities would be to waste precious time, to be dismissed and ignored while the clock ticked down to 0. But to do nothing? That was unthinkable. It would mean that every hour he'd spent, every connection he'd made, was a meaningless academic exercise. It would be a profound betrayal of Lily, the little girl who was screaming for help in the only way she knew how. He would be just another adult who saw her but didn't truly see. The choice was stark: risk being called a fool or live with the certainty of being a coward. He looked around the room at the walls covered in the frantic cartography of a child's fear. His role until this moment had been one of a ghost, an invisible observer cataloging a life from a distance. To intervene was to cross a line he had never intended to cross, to step out of the shadows and onto the stage itself. He would be walking into a situation orchestrated by a man he knew to be dangerous, armed with nothing but his own conviction. The final drawing he had pinned up was of Lily, standing alone, looking over her shoulder at a single open door. He realized now it wasn't a depiction of her fear. It was a plea, a silent invitation for someone, anyone, to step through it. The decision was made. He couldn't just watch anymore. He had to act. The map was no longer paper, but a grim reality of cracked earth and skeletal trees. Every step was an act of faith, a wager against the logic that said he was chasing ghosts. The silence here was an active, oppressive force, absorbing sound and hope. He pushed through tangled undergrowth, the branches scratching like skeletal fingers. His interpretation of Lily's art led him to this desolate fringe, a forgotten place. With every crunch of gravel, the immensity of his solitary mission settled heavier, armed with nothing but a theory born from crayon and fear. Then, a flicker of light against the muted landscape. Half buried in the dirt was a small silver hair clip, its butterfly charm chipped and faded. He knelt, his breath catching. He knew it instantly, it was the one Lily always wore. It could be a coincidence, a tragically misplaced trinket. But its position just off the path he followed felt too specific, too deliberate. This wasn't a lost item. It was a marker, the first tangible proof that his terrifying interpretation was anchored in the real world, a silent scream for help. He moved on, his senses hyper-attuned, scanning the ground not as a hiker but as a detective. The world was now a canvas of messages. Minutes later, the second sign. Placed perfectly atop a flat, moss-covered stone was a single crimson maple leaf. No maple trees grew in this dense, pine-choked thicket, its vibrant color a stark rebellion. This was no accident. This was intention. Lily hadn't just been here, she had been thinking, leaving a trail for someone who knew her to follow, creating a silent language of lost things. These weren't just clues, they were whispers from the edge of a nightmare. Each object was a paradox, a confirmation of her presence and a heartbreaking symbol of her absence. He could feel her small hand placing the leaf, her mind turning fear into a survival strategy. He was no longer following a map of a place, he was tracing the footsteps of her courage. This trail was a profound act of hope in the face of despair, a message directed at him, affirming the trust she had placed in their silent, unspoken connection. A few hundred yards later, a third sign confirmed the pattern. Tucked in the hollow of a fallen log was a smooth, gray stone with a single white stripe, identical to one from the collection on her windowsill. The path was real. The danger was real. But so was Lily's resilience. The desolate woods no longer felt merely threatening, they felt like a testament to her fight. His fear receded, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. He was no longer stumbling in the dark. He was on a path she had paved, and he would follow it to its end. The trail of lost things ended abruptly, not with a final clue, but with a sudden shift in the world around him. The air grew heavy, still carrying the tang of old machinery and damp concrete. He had stepped into a cavernous, forgotten space, an abandoned industrial complex, a skeleton of industry. The hum of the city was gone, replaced by his own breathing and the slow drip of water from a rusted girder. This was it. The place from the final, frantic drawing. It was larger, more menacing than any sketch could convey. A labyrinth of steel and shadow, waiting for its actors to take the stage. His eyes, accustomed to decoding Lily's visual language, began to scan the environment not as a place, but as a text. He saw the world through her perspective, mapping reality onto the lines she had drawn. The row of shattered windows she depicted as jagged teeth. The coiled cables she had rendered as a nest of snakes. Every detail, once an abstract symbol, now stood as a tangible threat. He moved with a predator's silence, his footsteps echoing softly. He wasn't just exploring, he was reading the architecture of a nightmare, knowing the author counted on him to understand. Then he saw it. In the center of the vast concrete floor, under a gaping hole in the roof that let in a single column of gray light. It was a detail so small he'd almost dismissed it, a unique, star-shaped crack in the pavement. Lily had drawn it with painstaking precision, a dark asterisk marking a specific point in space and time. This was the spot, the epicenter, the place where the silent, terrible event was meant to unfold. Standing there, Arthur felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air. It was the chill of certainty, of standing on the exact ground where a life was scheduled to end. His mind shifted instantly from decryption to strategy. Shock gave way to a cold, calculated focus. From this central point, he analyzed every angle, every shadow. He traced the path the antagonist would take, the sight lines from the upper gantries, the escape routes. The stacks of rusted barrels offered cover. The narrow maintenance corridor to his left provided a bottleneck, a perfect point for intervention. The environment was no longer a scene, it was a chessboard. He began choreographing his movements, planning to use the labyrinth's geometry against the one who was coming, turning the predator's hunting ground into a trap. In that moment of tactical clarity, the full weight of Lily's warnings crashed down. It was never just about where, it was about how. The drawing of the bird with a broken wing wasn't about her, but of the victim's fall from the gantry above. The hand reaching through bars wasn't a cry for help, but a depiction of the final struggle near the ventilation shaft. Every silent message was a frame-by-frame storyboard of the horror to come. She hadn't just given him a map, she had given him the script. And he had arrived just before the curtain rose on the final, tragic act. The stillness was broken not by a sound, but a presence. He emerged from the treeline, a figure of sharp angles and deliberate motion, pulling Lily along. She stumbled but never fell, her eyes darting through the gloom, searching. The antagonist moved with unnerving confidence, a predator in his killing field, oblivious to the hunter watching from the crags. He guided Lily toward the flat, altar-like stone at the center of the labyrinth's heart, the very spot Arthur had identified. The air grew thick, charged with a terrible, unspoken purpose, a silent promise of a ritual about to unfold. He positioned her before the stone, his movements precise, ceremonial. His back was to the forest, his attention solely on the girl and the grim task ahead. From his coat, he produced a small, ornate box, its dark wood absorbing the faint light. He didn't speak, but his lips moved, forming silent words of power. This was the moment Lily's map had warned of, the fulcrum upon which her fate balanced. For Arthur, hidden in the embrace of rock and shadow, it was the signal. The man's complete absorption provided the one opening he desperately needed. Arthur's hand closed around the heavy stone he had chosen. With a calculated flick, he sent it arcing through the air, not at the man, but at a precarious pile of shale to his left. The impact was a dull thud, followed by a cascade of sliding rock, a sound both natural and jarring in the heavy silence. It was enough. The antagonist flinched, his ritual broken. He whipped his head toward the sound, eyes narrowed in suspicion. For a critical second, his grip on Lily loosened as his body pivoted toward the unseen disturbance. In that sliver of time, Arthur descended. He moved not with a cry but with the silent swiftness of a ghost. The confrontation was immediate, a collision of bodies without a single word uttered. It was a battle of opposing philosophies in muscle and bone. The antagonist was brute force, his swings wide and powerful. Arthur was an extension of the labyrinth, elusive, unpredictable, using the uneven ground and grasping roots to his advantage. He ducked under a clumsy blow, the man's fist smashing into an ancient tree with a muted crunch of bone. Arthur never stopped moving, drawing the enraged man deeper into the clearing's treacherous periphery. He led him toward the hidden patch of soft, deep mud by the spring's overflow. The antagonist, blinded by fury and unfamiliar with the terrain, plunged forward. His heavy boots sank instantly, the thick mire clinging to him like a living thing, stealing his momentum and his balance. As he struggled, sputtering silent curses, Lily darted forward. She moved to the altar, snatched the ornate box, and retreated to the safety of the labyrinth's edge. The tide had been diverted entirely. The confrontation had reached a terrifying equilibrium, a silent, razor's edge where one wrong move meant failure. The antagonist held all the cards, his physical dominance and proximity to Lily creating a fortress Arthur could not breach. Every feint was met with a cold, calculated counter, pushing him back, reminding him of the situation's fragility. He was a protector held at bay by the very person he sought to save. The air was heavy, not with sound, but with the crushing weight of inevitability. The plan had brought him here, but now, trapped in this deadly tableau, Arthur could only wait for an opening that seemed destined never to appear. But in that suffocating silence, a different strength was gathering. Lily, no longer a passive pawn in this horrifying game, was not just an object to be protected. Her paralyzing fear began to crystallize into a sharp, focused resolve. She saw Arthur's struggle, his controlled desperation. She remembered the countless hours staring from her window, not in despair but in practice. They had built a language from nothing, a lexicon of gestures and glances. This was not just a fight for her life. It was the final utterance in a conversation spanning weeks of silent observation and trust. Then it came. Not a grand gesture, but something almost imperceptible, a movement the antagonist, consumed by his power, missed entirely. Her hand, held tightly at her side, moved. 2 fingers tapped twice against the seam of her jeans, a specific, practiced motion. It was the signal for blind spot. The one they had rehearsed endlessly through the glass, indicating a momentary shift in balance, a window of vulnerability on his left side. It was a whisper in a world without sound, a gamble placing all her faith in the man who learned to listen with his eyes. For Arthur, the signal was not a suggestion, it was a thunderclap. The world, which had slowed to a crawl, snapped back into motion. There was no thought, no hesitation, only a pure, instinctual reaction honed by weeks of relentless observation. He moved not toward the antagonist, but through the space Lily's signal had created. He exploited the momentary imbalance she had identified, a subtle shift in weight invisible to anyone else. The takedown was brutally efficient, a silent cascade of motion using the aggressor's own momentum against him, neutralizing the threat as quietly as it began. The sudden stillness that followed was different. The oppressive tension vanished, replaced by a vacuum, an echoing silence, final yet fragile. Lily stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. In that void, a new sound filtered in from the outside world, faint at first, then growing stronger. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots, the rhythmic pulse of flashing lights painting the walls. Help had arrived. The silent war was over, and the real world was rushing in to reclaim them, witnessing the quiet, definitive end of a nightmare. The arrival of authority was a storm of noise breaking a sacred silence. Sirens wailed, and shouted commands echoed where moments before, only the language of light mattered. Officers found a scene that defied their training, a threat neutralized without a word spoken between rescuer and victim. They saw the end result, the girl safe, the captor subdued, but the methodology was a void. Arthur stood apart from the chaos, a calm island in their sea of procedure. He authored this conclusion, yet to them he was just a bystander, a ghost in the machine of their unfolding investigation. The lead detective, who had dismissed Arthur's calls as paranoia, now faced an undeniable truth. His skepticism crumbled not before a weapon, but a desk covered in papers. There lay the Rosetta Stone of this silent rescue, charts of curtain movements, logs of flickering lights, and a diagram of the final gesture. It was a meticulous chronicle of fear translated into data. The detective finally understood this wasn't the work of a vigilante, but of a translator, a man who had learned to read a desperate message the world had failed to see, a plea hidden in the most mundane of daily routines. Amid the whirlwind of paramedics and tearful reunions, Lily's world began to stabilize. Wrapped in her mother's arms, she was finally safe, the terror receding into memory. But her eyes scanned the chaotic scene, searching for her anchor in the storm. She found Arthur near the edge of the property, about to fade into the shadows. Their eyes met across the lawn. No words were needed. A small, imperceptible nod was enough. It was a final, silent transmission. Thank you. It was the only validation he would ever need, a quiet acknowledgement that transcended the noise all around them. The official investigation was turned on its head. The case files, once filled with dead ends, were now amended with Arthur's strange, beautiful data. What they had dismissed as the ramblings of a nosy neighbor was now the primary evidence. They began to see the pattern he saw, to understand. The clues weren't in phone taps or statements, but in the mundane rhythm of a suburban home. His unorthodox method had succeeded where their entire apparatus failed, forcing a difficult re-evaluation of what it means to pay attention, to truly see what is right in front of them. Arthur sought no credit. As news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed toward the house. He slipped away. His work was done. His vindication wasn't in the headlines that would follow, nor in the reluctant praise from the police. It was in the quiet returning to the house across the street. It was in knowing that tonight, the lights in Lily's window would blink on and off not as a cry for help, but simply because a child was going to sleep. That was the sound of safety, a gentle, unremarkable, and profoundly beautiful silence. In the end, it was never about what Arthur couldn't hear. It was about what he was forced to see. Society often measures a person by the senses they possess, but it rarely considers the unique strengths born from the absence of one. For Arthur, the world was not a symphony of sounds, but a high-definition silent film playing out in real time. He didn't just look, he observed. He didn't just see, he decoded. While the rest of his neighborhood was distracted by the cacophony of life, the traffic, the televisions, the trivial arguments, Arthur's mind was a quiet, uncluttered space dedicated to processing visual information. His perceived limitation was, in fact, a cognitive superpower, granting him a level of focus and pattern recognition that a hearing person could never hope to achieve. His silence wasn't an absence. It was a filter, removing the noise to reveal the truth. We are all drowning in auditory static. The constant hum of the city, the endless notifications on our phones, the meaningless chatter that fills our days, it all creates a cognitive fog that dulls our other senses. We walk past crucial details, too busy listening to a podcast or a phone call to notice the subtle shift in a neighbor's routine or the flicker of fear in a stranger's eyes. Arthur was immune to this modern blindness. He operated on a different sensory plane, one where the rhythm of drawn curtains, the angle of a parked car, and the duration of a porch light were all critical data points. He was a human surveillance system, not out of paranoia but out of necessity. His world was a tapestry woven from light and shadow, and he had spent a lifetime learning to read its intricate patterns, a language that screamed danger long before a single sound was ever made. This silent language was the foundation of his bond with Lily. Their connection was something purer and more profound than a spoken friendship. It was a covenant of shared observation, forged through a pane of glass. To her, he wasn't the man who couldn't hear. He was the only person who truly saw her. To him, she was not just a girl in a window, she was a living narrative he felt compelled to protect. The final, desperate signal she gave him was not a random gesture. It was the climax of a long, silent conversation, the culmination of months of unspoken understanding. It was a testament to the fact that the most powerful forms of communication require no words at all, only a shared context and the courage to pay attention. Theirs was a dialogue of trust, written in the universal language of sight. The authorities and neighbors finally saw a hero, but they almost missed him entirely because they were listening for one. They expected heroism to be loud, to announce itself with a shout or a siren. Arthur's story serves as a powerful testament that the most profound acts of courage are often silent. His true victory wasn't won in the final confrontation. It was earned in the countless, lonely hours he spent at his window, meticulously piecing together a puzzle no one else even knew existed. He was a quiet guardian, a sentinel whose only weapon was his unwavering focus. He redefined what it means to be a protector, proving that listening is not an act of the ears, but an act of the soul, an unwavering commitment to bearing witness. In a world that screams for our attention, Arthur's story is a whisper, reminding us of the power of quiet observation. It challenges us to put down our phones, to take out our earbuds, and to simply watch the world around us. What silent stories are unfolding on your street? What unspoken truths are hidden in plain sight? The most important dramas are often the ones that play out without a script, seen only by those who are willing to look. If this story made you see the world a little differently, make sure you subscribe and enable notifications. Because the next silent hero we uncover might be living right next door, and their story is one you will not want to miss.